There is a particular kind of arithmetic that runs quietly in the background of certain lives, uninvited, comparing what you have built to some invisible schedule you never actually agreed to. A milestone reached by someone your age, mentioned in passing, and something in you quietly recalculates again how far behind you appear to be. You cannot always locate where this schedule came from. You only know that you seem to be measured against it constantly, and that you rarely, if ever, come out ahead. Why does a timeline no one ever formally handed you feel so absolute, so capable of producing genuine distress when you appear to be falling short of it? Why does behind feel like such a precise, factual measurement when no one can actually agree on what it's measuring you against? Before we explore this together, subscribe to this channel where we uncover the hidden psychology behind everyday life. Picture a tree standing at the edge of a forest, its branches still bare in early spring, while every tree around it has already begun to bud. Anyone glancing quickly might assume something is wrong with it slower, weaker, somehow behind the others. But trees do not grow on identical timelines, even within the same forest, even in the same season. Some root systems require more time before growth becomes visible above ground. Is the bare tree failing, or is it simply following a timeline the observer cannot see, working at a pace suited to its own particular soil, its own particular roots? Carl Jung believed that comparing one's own inner development to someone else's outer timeline is one of the most reliable ways to lose touch with who you actually are. He might have asked, gently, why a person would measure their own unique, unrepeatable unfolding against a stranger's entirely different one, as though both were following identical instructions toward an identical destination. What if the very idea of being behind only makes sense if everyone were actually running the same race to begin with? Here is the quiet distortion worth naming plainly. The timeline you are measuring yourself against was likely never yours. It was assembled, largely unconsciously, from other people's milestones: a friend's promotion, a sibling's marriage, a stranger's visible success online, stitched together into an imaginary schedule that feels somehow like an objective standard, despite having been built from comparisons that have almost nothing to do with your actual life. Why does this borrowed timeline feel so convincing, even though its origins are so scattered and arbitrary? Because comparison happens quickly, automatically, often before conscious thought can intervene. You do not choose to measure yourself against someone else's career, their relationship, their apparent stability. The comparison simply occurs, and by the time you notice it happening, the resulting sense of falling short already feels like established fact rather than a distortion worth questioning. Alfred Adler believed that a persistent sense of inferiority, left unexamined, tends to organize an enormous amount of a person's behavior, sometimes toward genuine growth, but often, less helpfully, toward an anxious chase for external markers meant to finally prove one's adequacy once and for all. Is the feeling of being behind actually about your own life? Or is it, more precisely, about an old, unresolved question regarding your own worth, using someone else's timeline simply as the latest measuring stick? Jung might have said that this feeling often draws its power from an unexamined shadow, a private, long-held belief that you are somehow insufficient, dressed up convincingly as a factual observation about your progress compared to others. And here is the more uncomfortable question worth asking honestly. If the specific comparison currently troubling you disappeared entirely tomorrow, would the underlying feeling actually vanish with it, or would your mind simply locate a new comparison to take its place? Picture the tree again, standing bare while its neighbors have already begun to bloom. Beneath the surface, unseen by anyone glancing quickly past it, Its roots may be doing work that will not become visible for weeks or months, work that has nothing to do with the pace of the trees around it. Is bareness always failure? Or can it be, quite simply, a different timeline, doing exactly what it needs to do, entirely unconcerned with how it appears from the outside? This is the turn worth making gently here. The sense of being behind, uncomfortable as it feels, may not be evidence of failure at all. It may simply be evidence that you have been measuring an inner process, your own particular unfolding, using an outer ruler that was never designed to capture it. Jung called the process of becoming fully, authentically, yourself individuation. And he was clear that this process unfolds on its own timeline, shaped by your specific history, your specific wounds, your specific capacities, in a sequence that comparison can only ever distort rather than clarify. Individuation rarely follows a predictable schedule. It tends to arrive in its own time, often later than expected, and almost never in the order anyone else's life would suggest. So what do you do with the discomfort of feeling behind in the actual moment it arises? This is where the observer becomes essential, the quiet witness inside you, capable of noticing a comparison the instant it begins, before it fully calcifies into belief. Not the part of you that immediately accepts the comparison as an accurate account of your worth. The part that can simply notice, calmly, I am comparing my current chapter to someone else's, and these two stories were never actually measuring the same thing. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that very little disturbs a person as thoroughly as their own unexamined judgments, more so than the actual circumstances those judgments describe. Can you notice the sting of a comparison rising and pause there, asking honestly whether the timeline producing that sting was ever something you consciously chose to measure yourself against? Can you hold the discomfort without accepting its verdict as fact? And here is something worth noticing. If you look honestly, this exact feeling, the quiet sense of falling behind some invisible schedule, has likely visited you before, at earlier points in your life, in different disguises, attached to different milestones. Why does life seem to offer this same uncomfortable comparison again and again, in new forms, until it is finally recognized clearly enough to be released rather than simply outgrown temporarily? Jung believed that whatever remains unconscious in us tends to reappear in our lives as pattern, as recurring discomfort, until it is finally understood rather than repeatedly, unconsciously relived. Perhaps this is not really about the specific milestone currently troubling you. Perhaps it is the newest version of an older question. When did you first learn to measure your own worth by comparison rather than by your own honest standards? And are you finally ready to set that measurement down? Viktor Frankl, who wrote extensively on the search for meaning, believed that a life examined only against external timelines will always feel incomplete. Because meaning is never actually found in comparison, it is found in the particular, unrepeatable path of one's own life, examined honestly on its own terms. You cannot control the pace at which other people's lives appear to unfold. But the space between noticing a comparison rising and choosing not to accept its verdict, that space belongs entirely to you. So what would it actually look like to release the idea of being behind altogether? Not something dramatic, not a single sweeping decision to stop noticing other people's lives entirely. It might look like acknowledging a milestone you have not yet reached, without immediately converting that fact into evidence of failure. It might look like sitting with your own current chapter, exactly as it is, and finding it enough, at least for today, without needing it to resemble anyone else's. It might look like choosing peace over the exhausting habit of measuring your unfolding life against someone else's highlight reel. It might look like trusting that your own particular roots, unseen and unglamorous as they may currently be, are doing work that will eventually become visible in its own time. None of this arrives with fanfare. Jung once suggested that people will do almost anything to avoid facing an old, unresolved belief about their own worth, and if that is true, then simply noticing a comparison honestly, without immediately believing it, may already be a significant act of courage. Return for a moment to that bare tree at the edge of the forest, still leafless, while everything nearby has already begun to bloom. Imagine standing beside it now, not to hurry its growth, not to compare it unfavorably to its neighbors, but simply to trust that its timeline was never meant to match theirs in the first place. Does that make its bareness a flaw? Or does it simply mean its season has not yet fully arrived? And so we return to the question beneath this entire feeling, beneath every quiet comparison, every borrowed timeline, every private sense of falling short of a schedule that was never truly yours to begin with. What actually remains of your own life? Once every external measurement is finally set aside, what remains when your worth no longer depends on how your chapter compares to someone else's? Jung offered an answer that has outlasted him by nearly a century. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Perhaps you were never actually behind. Perhaps you were simply following your own particular timeline, one that was never going to resemble anyone else's, and was never required to. If this resonated, subscribe to this channel and join us as we keep uncovering these hidden truths. What is one milestone you're learning to release from someone else's timeline and reclaim on your own? Write it in the comments below and let that tree, wherever it stands in you, finally bloom in its own season.